let me welcome our third speaker in this session, Mary McLeod. Mary is a professor of architecture, architectural history and theory at Columbia University. Her research has focused on the history of the modern movement and on contemporary architectural theory, in particular focusing on the connections between architecture and ideology. Mary, welcome. Here's the microphone. Are you okay to hold it?
Yeah, I guess we need to. Just,
Can I get you some water?
yeah. First, to Jana, a warm thanks for inviting me. I'm not sure all former students would dare invite their former professor, especially when they gave them so much grief over the years. But it's a real pleasure to be here and also to see other friends from Prague. I'm delighted to be back and also with these great other speakers. I feel kind of funny coming after Hilda, whose actual progression with perhaps did not get that Latour, and I always had a skeptical side, reflects a lot my own, but I'm going to be very much more focused on one person, Kenneth Frampton, and perhaps we can talk about an earlier phase of the notion of critical and architectural theory. Today, we take the word, just a moment, I have to learn how to use this, I guess it's just like that. The word critical almost for granted as a term used to describe certain tendencies or ambitions in architectural history and certain kinds of architecture, or to use a sort of fashionable word, spatial practice. Its usage has become almost ubiquitous since that one essay of Michael Hayes I showed you in the early 80s, and it seems to serve as a trope indicating, in a rather vague way, both analytical rigor and leftist political sympathies. And I'm just going to show you as kind of proof of its proliferation as a term, a bunch of titles. I left out Hilda's new book. And there. What is usually less recognized by architectural historians, theorists, and practitioners, whether pro or post-critical, is how deeply indebted they are to Kenneth Frampton for the term critical in architecture. In 1980, Frampton was one of the first, if not the first, to use critical in the title of an English language book on architecture, Modern Architecture, A Critical History. And its numerous editions and numerous translations, what happened? There it is. Only made this term critical all the more present throughout the world, really globally, and I'm sure I'm missing some recent translations. However, it should be noted, as we've heard during the day, that he was by no means the first in architecture to be concerned with this issue. He was preceded, of course, by the early and more explicitly Marxist studies of the Venice School. I seem to have lost my voice just as I'm speaking. The word also appears, and I'm going back to Kenneth now, in other writings, including in the title of an issue of an AD profile that Frampton edited in 1982, Modern Architecture in the Critical Present, and in the title of his influential 1983 essay, Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance. He employed it in his teaching as well, in the seminar Comparative Critical Analysis of Built Form, which he taught at Princeton University beginning in the late 60s, and then at Columbia University intermittently for almost 50 years. This pedagogical approach is encapsulated in his 2015 book, A Genealogy of Modern Architecture, Comparative Critical Analysis of Built Form, which provides an eloquent synopsis of the concerns that have shaped Frampton's teaching over the years. But what specifically does Frampton mean by critical? Although he gives us a few hints as to its meaning, it is not something he has ever discussed at length. One might say the word is almost synecdochal for him, in that it stands for a larger set of social concerns and agendas, including his commitment to leftist politics, which he has only occasionally articulated at length. The word critical, as we know in this room, has a long history, one that derives from the Greek word kritikos, meaning judgment or discernment. And its modern usage, as again most people in this room certainly know, derives from Immanuel Kant's, its modern usage, three critiques, especially the critique of pure reason, in which Kant attempts to examine the limits of validity of a faculty, type, or body of knowledge through reflection. And then second, of course, from Karl Marx's critique of political economy and capital, in which critique is seen as a kind of ideological dismantling, revealing the contradictions within capital itself. In general, this has meant that the word is associated with a certain kind of critical self-reflexivity, an examination that goes beyond intention or popular reception, and in the case of Marxist theorists, a belief that such critical examination, at least Marxist theorists to a point, can contribute to social and political transformation. But Frampton's source, more specifically, and I think we already saw this building in Hilda's lecture, like that for many others of his and my own generation, is the Frankfurt School, the group of scholars who worked at the Institute for Social Research in the 1930s in Germany, including Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, as well as those thinkers closely affiliated with it, such as Walter Benjamin. These scholars attempted to extend Marxism's ideological critique to the cultural sphere and to examine how mass culture had changed arts production and reception, and thus possibilities for radical social transformation. Critical theory was intended to produce a kind of knowledge, one grounded in the historical context of both the object of study and the researcher, that was both elucidating, and emancipatory. Thus, in contrast to positivist knowledge, which we could see as envisioning natural science as a model of all cognition, this knowledge was seen as a form of action or praxis, and thus a means for social betterment. This objective, too, is fundamental to Frampton's own work. Frampton was among the first in the English-speaking architectural world to read and reflect upon the Frankfurt School, and specifically Benjamin's writings. In his Introduction to Modern Architecture, he begins, 1980, he begins with a quote from Benjamin's Theses on the Philosophy of History, and I won't read it here, most of you know it. It has to do with Benjamin's well-known interpretation of Clay's famous etching of the angel, ending, "This storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress." Later, in the introduction to his book, Frampton states that he was influenced by a Marxist interpretation of history, referring, quote, to his affinity with the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, unquote, and the way it made him, quote, acutely aware of the dark side of the Enlightenment. Frampton's interest in Benjamin and the Frankfurt School, however, predates the publication of Modern Architecture by more than a decade. In fact, he had already decided on the subtitle of the book in 1970 when he agreed to write the Thames and Hudson Survey. And in 1973, he used the same passage from Theses on the Philosophy of History that opens modern architecture in an epigraph for his essay, Industrialization and the Crises in Architecture. This essay was published in the first issue of Oppositions, and he would later characterize it as, quote, as a somewhat naive attempt to adopt a Benjaminian approach to historical phenomenon. How did Frampton discover Benjamin, and more generally, leftist politics? Perhaps not coincidentally, his seminal essay on Pierre Charot's Maison de Verre appeared in the same 1969 issue of Perspecta, Yale's student-produced magazine, as the translation of Benjamin's synopsis of his Arcades project, Paris, Capital of the 19th Century. In this regard, the meticulously designed issue more of the Benjamin, it's very nicely illustrated. The embossed cover of which evokes the rubber tiles of the Maison de Verre, encapsulates both sides of Frampton's thought. His deep concern for architecture's formal and structural qualities and his social and political investigations, which sought to establish the links between politics, social conditions, and form. But more important, the 1960s were a moment of intense political engagement for many in the United States. First, the civil rights movement, followed by the increasingly intense protests against the Vietnam War, and then the women's liberation movement. Frampton has said that paradoxically, it was going to the States that radicalized him. He explains his conversion by quoting a comment that the English architect Michael Gleichmann once made to him. You have to understand, quote, in England the claws are hidden, but in the States they are visible. In other words, the brutality and pervasive power of capitalism and the military-industrial state were blatantly visible in the US. Like others at Princeton School of Architecture, and he came, I think it's 66, but late 60s, he was involved in the university strike of May 1970 after the Kent State massacre. There you see the dean, that's Tony Vidler. I'm not sure where Ken is, but he was definitely there, and they're all arguing over the strike manifesto. And it was actually the architecture school that issued one of the first proclamations before the school went on strike. Frampton's interest in Benjamin was undoubtedly sparked by his admiration of Hannah Arendt, which dates back to the 60s, still very much apparent in his 2015 Genealogy of Modern Architecture. Arendt edited and wrote the introduction of Illuminations, the first collection in English of Benjamin's writings. The book came out in '68 and included Benjamin's well-known essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, how it was translated then, as well as his theses on the philosophy of history. These two essays might be seen as embodying the two sides of Frampton's interest in Benjamin during this period. On the one hand, his almost utopian faith in technology's potential to improve human life, and his deep commitment to mass housing, which parallels in some ways Benjamin's position in the first essay. And on the other hand, his increasing pessimism about society's capacity to use technology judiciously and to sustain an authentic and meaningful culture in the face of ever-sweeping modernization, even as one accepts its inevitability. Paul Clay's Angel, being blown forward even as it looks to the past, and Benjamin's theses. I guess you should see the angel. An additional influence on Frampton in the late 1960s was the Frankfurt School philosopher Herbert Marcuse. Alan Cahoon, who taught with Frampton at Princeton in the 1960s, had given him his copy of Eros and Civilization, first published in 1955 and reissued in 1966. And I can't resist not showing you Ken's edition, which I was fortunate to see. There and there. Yeah. Yeah, they're all Ken, and he never gave back poor Alan's copy back to him. It was very important to Kenneth, and maybe answers Jana's comment about Reich and the erotic and the psychological parts of that moment in the US at least. In this book, which was seminal to the emergence of the New Left and a political strain of American counterculture, Marcuse focused not on class struggle, but rather on the repression of Eros, which he saw as a product of contemporary industrial relations, namely the alienated labor of advanced industrial society. Marcuse called for a non-repressive civilization founded on non-alienated libidinal work, a goal reminiscent of that of the 19th century French utopian socialist Charles Fourier. These themes resonated with Frampton's own growing concern for craft and attention to detail, what I might call care, and for the sensuous aspects of architecture, or put another way, his refusal, quote, to separate the reality of work from the pleasure of life, as he succinctly put it in his 1976 essay, The Volvo Case. The role that Marcuse, and more generally the Frankfurt School, played in the evolution of Frampton's own thinking is most evident in the postscript to his 1983 essay on Arendt, quote, the status of man and the status of his objects. Here he mentions two issues that he felt Arendt, who was not a Marxist, and by the way, in the audience when he first gave this talk, had either suppressed or suspended in her conclusion to the human condition. First, the problematic cultural status of play and pleasure in a future laboring society with its hypothetical liberation from the compulsion of consumption, quote, in parens, Marcuse. Second, the remote and critical possibility for mediating the autonomous rationality of science and technique through the effective reconstitution of an effective political realm, Habermas. Frampton's copy of Eros and Civilization is so well worn and marked up that its cover and Cahoon's inscription have long since disappeared. He kept looking for it for me, couldn't find it. Thus, it is these two authors, Benjamin and Marcuse, who introduced Frampton in the late 1960s to the Frankfurt School and what came to be known as critical theory with capital letters. They would soon be followed by Jürgen Habermas, just cited, whose Towards a Rational Society was translated into English in 1970, and Adorno, whose Minima Moralia, 1951, was translated into English in 1974. Alessandro Latour, an Italian graduate student and teacher in urban design at Columbia, and then a committed Marxist, gave Frampton a copy of Adorno's book. And in his 1983 essay on Arendt, begins with a quotation from it, one that again encapsulates the mixture of despair and messianic hope that has characterized so much of Frampton's own writing since the 1960s. Until the 1980s, very little of Adorno or Horkheimer had been translated into English, and Frampton readily admits that he never read cover to cover the one book that seems to correspond most with his own disdain for commodification and mass culture, Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of the Enlightenment, which had been translated into English in 1972. Adorno's aesthetic philosophy was not translated until '84, later retranslated in the late 90s. Two more thinkers, however, individuals with whom Frampton had direct personal contact, are crucial to understanding his interest in Marxist cultural theory, and especially in its potential application to architecture. The first is Thomas Maldonado, the Argentine concrete painter, industrial designer, and theorist, who succeeded Max Bill as rector at Ulm, and who was also a visiting professor at Princeton in the late 1960s. Frampton had already met Maldonado at Ulm, that is the school, in 1963 when he visited Germany as a technical editor of AD. At that time, he also encountered a second individual, the Swiss, French, but German-speaking Marxist Claude Schneidt, who also taught at Ulm and who would write the first monograph on Hannes Meyer, a book that Frampton has long admired. There's my own beat-up copy. Frampton discussed both writers, that is Maldonado and Schneidt, in his 1974 essay, Apropos Ulm, Curriculum and Critical Theory, in Oppositions 3, which was his first published use of the word critical in a title. In Ulm, he explained he found a model for raising, quote, critical consciousness of the role of design in contemporary society. Maldonado had in fact used the word critical in the subtitle of the 1972 English translation of La Speranza Progettuale, I can't say it in Italian, which was titled in English, Design, Nature, and Revolution Towards a Critical Ecology. It should be noted, though, that Frampton's use of the word critical here has little to do, has little to do with the Frankfurt School, but rather with a more general commitment to a Marxist position that unites theory and action. Maldonado specifically cites Antonio Gramsci for his theory of praxeology, or, quote, theory of practice, what he calls, quote, a model of action oriented toward overcoming the dichotomy between theory and practice, unquote. One of the most telling quotes in modern architecture critical history is from Schneidt's essay, Architecture and Political Commitment of 1967. And it is worth repeating in full, although I'll shorten it, as it so eloquently summarizes the critical position that underlies Frampton's own text. There it is. Schneidt writes, in the days when the pioneers of modern architecture were still young, they thought, like William Morris, that architecture should be an art of the people for the people. Instead of pandering to the tastes of the privileged few, they wanted to satisfy the requirements of the community. But then he goes on to say, the rational dwelling was transformed into the minimum dwelling, the cité radieuse into the urban conglomeration and austerity of line into poverty of form. The architects of the trade unions, cooperatives, and social municipalities were enlisted in the service of whiskey distillers, detergent manufacturers, the bankers, and the Vatican. Modern architecture, which wanted to play its part in the liberation of mankind by creating a new environment to live in, was transformed into a giant enterprise for the degradation of the human habitat. With this statement, Schneidt, and thus Frampton, was insisting upon the need to recognize the extent that modern architecture, despite its progressive intentions, had been shaped by the dictates of profit and capitalism. But also implicit in this passage, and perhaps even more clearly in Frampton's conclusion in the book, is the desire to propose something more than minimum dwelling, a commitment to a richer, more fulfilling world. And here we have again the particular synthesis that underlies so much of Frampton's thought and what might be seen as the goal of his critical perspective, an architectural modernity that is not reduced to rational instrumentality and minimum dwelling, but rather offers a liberatory vision that enriches habitation and community life while still embracing technological progress. In other words, it is an architectural vision very much compatible with Marcuse's broader cultural argument in Eros and Civilization. Frampton's discontent with architecture's commodification and environmental degradation was further fueled by the rise of postmodern architecture and its increasing emphasis on scenographic effects and design. This is very apparent by 1983, the year of his AD issue, Modern Architecture in the Critical Present, and the publication of Towards a Critical Regionalism. The anthology in which it was published, Hal Foster's Anti-Aesthetic, also included Habermas's sweeping indictment of postmodern thought, prompted by the Venice Architecture Biennale of 1980, and in part the motivation for Frampton's own essay. For those who don't know, he was originally on the organizing committee and got soon very disgusted and withdrew. The intense debate among architects and social thinkers of the period, arising from discussions about postmodernism, had intensified Frampton's awareness not only of the failures and limits of the modern movement's embrace of technology and social transformation, but also of the increasing complicity of contemporary architecture with the forces of capitalism. In other words, he used his citations of members of the Frankfurt School and Marxists, such as Schneidt and Maldonado, to criticize both modern and postmodern architecture, if increasingly with a critical lens directed at the latter. But it might also be said, as Frederick Jameson later so brilliantly explicated in The Seeds of Time, 1994, that Frampton's, quote, arrière-garde critique was itself participating in the celebration of pluralism and difference so typical of both postmodernism and late capitalism, that is, a post-Fordist economy that can customize its products for local markets, even as it sought to retain some vestige of utopian hope in its proposal of an architecture, quote, of resistance. One might say that he hoped to fashion a progressive strategy out of the materials of tradition and nostalgia, as well as a more considered use of technology that would stand, even if metatomically, against the commodification rampant in late capitalism. Frampton continued to share with Marcuse a belief in art as a reminder of an alternative world, even as he acknowledged its incapacity to effect large-scale change, at least without the presence of larger political, social, and cultural movements. As important as the Frankfurt School was to Frampton, his understanding of what a critical position might entail can also be seen as linked to another tradition, perhaps not consciously on his part, one that has been very much part of his thoughts since the early 1970s. Habermas, in his 1968 book, Knowledge and Human Interest, distinguished between critical political theory and social theory. That is, notably between the Frankfurt school and a self-reflective cultural theory. Habermas equated the latter with hermeneutics, a theory concerned with the meaning of human texts and symbolic expressions, one that effaces the boundary between factual and symbolic understanding. While Habermas acknowledged the conservative side of hermeneutics, that it is inherently concerned with existing meanings and cultural tradition rather than with new possibilities and thus social transformation, he argued that it offers a necessary critique of positivism in its insistence on individual life experience, which can then be adapted to general categories. Although literary critical theory is now associated with numerous other tendencies, as Hilda so well showed, including Derridian deconstruction, post-colonial theory, identity politics, gender studies, and even environmental analyses, this other, earlier meaning of cultural theory that Habermas articulated seems to reflect Frampton's own concerns for meaning and cultural expression, even if they have evolved over the years to include some of the approaches just mentioned. This is perhaps never so apparent as in his oft-cited and influential essay I mentioned earlier, 1983's Towards a Critical Regionalism. It opens with a long quotation from Ricoeur's 1961 essay, Universal Civilization and National Cultures. Ricoeur, who is known for uniting phenomenology and hermeneutics and for extending hermeneutic investigation beyond the literary sphere, presciently posed the recurring quandary of underdeveloped nations, but one that affects all cultures. There is the paradox, how to become modern and to return to the sources, how to revive an old dormant civilization, which he referred to earlier as a cultural past, and take part in universal civilization. Frampton was introduced to Ricoeur's work by the phenomenologist, someone everybody in Prague may know in this room, the phenomenologist Dalibor Vesely, who had opted not to review Frampton's modern architecture in the 1983 special issue of AD. Embracing Ricoeur's paradox, that is between modernity and tradition, or between universal civilization and regional cultures, Frampton proposed in his influential 1983 essay a strategy, as I referred to earlier, arrière-garde action, a kind of holding operation, salvaging the cultural meaning of architecture against the onslaught of an ever-pervasive instrumental rationality. And I'm going to shorten because I know we're getting out of time, but he includes a variety of sources, Marcuse, Benjamin, Heidegger, almost fragments, sort of in a Benjaminian style, to make his argument about place, light, tactility, and the qualities he so values in this essay. It's a strange combination, we might say, between Marxism and phenomenology, one that isn't, of course, unique to him. There were Marxists like Jean-Paul Sartre, referred to earlier, post-war especially, and Merleau-Ponty in his younger years, who tried to make such a reconciliation. Tafori himself admits in his largely positive review, I'm one behind, of Frampton's book, that such a reconciliation between these two seemingly disparate positions is possible, although Frampton himself has never systematically, and I'm quoting him, done so in his writing. And it's only later that he'll read Merleau-Ponty in the 2015 book I mentioned. In Towards a Critical Regionalism, one senses, perhaps more than any of his other writings to date, the importance of the word critical for Frampton. He believed it was essential to distinguish his vision of regionalism from conservative appeals to nostalgia and tradition, and even from its lingering associations with blood and soil, a position he states forcefully in his third point. Nevertheless, one wonders if his commitment to political critique is undermined or mitigated by his reveries about architecture's experiential qualities. Can the qualities that he so deeply values in architecture, such as tactility and the articulation of structure, really serve as modes of resistance, as a kind of holding operation? Is it possible to reconcile his belief in technology as a democratic and liberating tool that can improve living conditions for all classes, especially the most impoverished, with his rejection of mass culture and technology's pervasive presence in American society, which he associates with mindless gratification and environmental degradation? And given the proliferation of images and homogenizing effects of ever-increasing globalization, is it possible to accept his commitment to structure over surface effects, or his emphasis on place and urban identity, especially in contexts that seem to defy any kind of regional or even topographical specificity? Whether one accepts his synthesis or not, or even fully embraces his aesthetic vision, what undoubtedly makes his position so appealing to so many architects is his belief that critique should not be fully negative, it should not only serve to elucidate the shortcomings and contradictions of the status quo, but also take the risk of proposing alternatives that might offer, however modestly, the promise of a richer, more fulfilling existence. Again, to shorten this talk, he fully admits in taking this position that he's an operative critic, exactly the kind of person DeFore criticizes. However, I'd like to suggest, and this might be controversial, that the gap between DeFore, first though I want to show, he argues for showing examples of positive work, and he's willing to propose strategies that he thinks will inspire architects. He hopes to do, quote, a wide variety of work. And here are two of his favorite examples, of course, Aalto's Sannyatsalo and Utsin's Bagsvad Church. Nevertheless, the gap between DeFore and Frampton might not be as great as it first appears. At the conclusion of Architecture in Utopia, and after a relentless account of architecture's useless utopianism and its serial failures to generate radical social change, DeFore offers a glimmer of hope to architects. They might work in public offices as technicians, that is, as organizers of building activities and planners of process, a role involving the dissolution of traditional disciplinary boundaries. Frampton's hope, though, resides within architecture itself. He is willing to see the generative and positive qualities of form and experience in order to create a space for architectural practice that resists the most blatant forces of commodification. He's acutely aware of the difficulties of his own belief in the transformative powers of architecture and criticism. And in a 2001 interview with Gevorg Hartunian, he specifically addresses DeFore's rejection of operative history. I was recently rereading the dialectic introduction, wherein he, DeFore, writes, "Doing away with outdated myths, one certainly does not see on the architectural horizon any ray of an alternative of a technology of the working class. I am aware that the Marxist hardline, then as now, thinks of my writing as operative criticism, as permitting the survival of an anachronistic hopes of design as a liberative agent, which Tafori dismisses as regressive. However, he also concedes that the present circumstances one is, quote, left to navigate in empty space, in which anything can happen but nothing is decisive, which sums up, I suppose, basically what I think about my position. And in the last essay of his book, Labor, Work, and Architecture, Minimal Moralia, Reflections on Recent Swiss-German Production, 1997, a rather sharp assessment of some recent trends in Swiss architecture, Frampton states in a beautiful passage what navigating and writing in this empty space means to him. This is the last line. Well, I should go back to that quote. One can only hope that others would be able to sustain their early capacity, or alternatively, to reveal an untapped potential for the pursuit of the art of architecture in all its anachronistic fullness. One perhaps needs to add that one does not indulge in critique for the sake of gratuitous negativity, but rather to spur the critical sensibility, to sharpen the debate, to overcome, as far as this is feasible, the debilitating dictates of fashion, and above all, to guard against the ever-present threat of a mediatic age, of sliding into intellectual somnambulance, I can't talk at this with jet lag, where everything seems to appear to be for the aestheticized best in the best of all commodified worlds. I would just like, and I know this is nostalgic to say, last month Ken Frampton turned 95, and I think is still trying to harbor some kind of hope in what a world that he sees increasingly depressing and full of commodification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. We have time for maybe one or two questions for a very short discussion. Then we'll have a short break and we'll continue with the final session. Does anyone have a pressing question to ask our panelists? Or do you want to do so in private during the coffee break? Shall we? Okay, then, so we'll have a short coffee break. You can find the panelists during the break, and then we'll continue in 10 minutes with the final session of today. So thank you very much.